Trump and Marco Rubio lost patience with the Cuban communist farce, and the pressure against Cuba inside the White House put the communist regime at the center of a new United States offensive. Yesterday's cabinet meeting, May 27, set the stage that this Thursday, May 28, 2026, shows Washington treating the Cuban crisis as the main threat, right below the war against the Iranian dictatorship. Rubio spoke alongside Trump, attacked communist incompetence, and pointed to Gaza as the machine controlling the Cuban economy. And he made it clear that an island sunk in blackouts, shortages, mass exodus, and an elite protected just 90 miles from the American coast can no longer be ignored. The communist farce was exposed because the regime blames the United States, but its own leaders control wealth, their families seek life under capitalism, and the Cuban people remain abandoned. What is Cuba hiding? Why does the elite flee to Miami? How is Trump going to step up the pressure now? I'll tell you all about it in a moment. If you like this kind of direct and straightforward content, consider subscribing because we have videos like this every day. Rubio's speech at the cabinet meeting was the main point of the message. The Secretary of State said that Cuba is in a lot of trouble because it is governed by incompetent communists. He didn't treat communism as just empty ideological debate. He pointed directly at the regime's structure and mentioned Gaza, a conglomerate linked to the Cuban military, as the central piece of the island's economy. The view in Washington is that wealth doesn't reach the ordinary citizen because it remains concentrated in a system controlled by a political and military elite. That's where Trump and Rubio changed the framing. The Cuban crisis isn't just about a lack of electricity, food, or fuel. It's a system set up to preserve those at the top while the people pay the price. Rubio also said that the United States wants something good for the Cuban people, but made it clear that a failed state near the American coast becomes a national security problem. That statement carries weight because it takes Cuba out of the left's romantic propaganda narrative and puts the island on the White House's strategic map. For Trump, it's not about persecuting ordinary Cubans. The political target is the leadership that uses the flag, revolutionary rhetoric, and accusations against Washington to hide their own responsibility for the internal collapse. Gaza came under pressure because it represents the financial heart of the regime. The group operates in areas such as hotels, ports, banks, markets, fuel, and remittances. Rubio has been saying that this model works as a state within a state, without transparency and without accountability to the Cuban people. When a military structure controls profitable sectors, while families face blackouts and empty store shelves, the narrative of resistance loses strength. What emerges is a closed elite with access to money, real estate, travel, and political protection. Havana's response came as expected. Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez brought the issue to the UN, and he accused the United States of pressure, threats, and an energy blockade. The regime tried to turn Trump's offensive into an international denunciation, asking for support from other nations and speaking of the risk of a humanitarian catastrophe. But this reaction also reveals weakness. Cuba is rushing to the diplomatic stage because it feels that the pressure has stopped targeting just speeches and has started to affect the mechanisms that sustain the regime's power. Havana's attempt is clear: to place the blame outside the island while avoiding explaining why the population lives with blackouts, crushed wages, lack of food, lack of medicine, and constant exodus. The regime tries to sell resistance, but the ordinary Cuban sees something else in real life. The power goes out, food gets more expensive, transportation breaks down, young people look for a way out, and the families in power keep their doors open outside the island. This contradiction is what Trump and Rubio are aggressively exploiting. The case of Alina Rosales Aguirre Oreta has further increased the damage to the Cuban elite. She is the daughter of General Ulysses Rosales del Toro, a historic figure in Havana's military and political apparatus, and was detained by U.S. immigration authorities. The news gained traction because it shows an uncomfortable scene for the regime. Relatives connected to the Cuban high command living or trying to settle in U.S. soil. While millions of ordinary Cubans face enormous difficulties to leave the island or get their own lives in order. This episode strengthens the view that the communist elite condemns capitalism in public, but seeks refuge in capitalism when they need to protect their own family. It's a symbolic blow. The Cuban people have heard for decades that the United States is the enemy. But they see relatives of historic leaders living in South Florida, entering with visas, trying to adjust their immigration status, and living far from the lines, blackouts, and shortages that affect the population. The Cuban collapse is not confined to the island. It crosses borders, fuels illegal networks, and puts pressure on several nations in the region. Recent news has shown Cubans in immigration limbo in Mexico, without legal guarantees and struggling to access basic services. It also showed 18 Cubans intercepted in Brazil, in Roraima, on an illegal route that involved vehicles and suspects of human trafficking. Among the migrants, there were children and elderly people. This data shows the practical consequence of socialist failure. When a nation destroys the minimum living conditions, people flee by any means. They take dangerous routes, cross fragile borders, fall into the hands of intermediaries, and try to reach places where they can work, eat, move around, and live without fear. The left calls this Cuban resistance. In practice, it's an exodus. An exodus doesn't come from prosperity, it comes from despair. Trump and Rubio are also using economic pressure as a political tool. The executive order signed by Trump in May expanded sanctions against structures linked to the Cuban regime, affecting strategic sectors and increasing the risk for foreign companies that help sustain areas controlled by the leadership. After that, the American administration began targeting names, entities, and economic arms linked to the military. The logic is simple. If the regime is financed by companies that are closed and controlled by generals, the pressure needs to be applied right there. This strategy leaves Havana without the comfort of blaming only the old embargo. The White House is pointing out names, structures, money, and networks of influence. Rubio is not just talking about communism in theory. He is saying that there is a concrete mechanism behind the suffering in Cuba. Another contradiction weighs against the regime. Cuba accuses Washington of suffocating it, but depends on imports and commercial loopholes linked to the American market itself. Reports indicate that exports of fuels and oils from the United States to Cuba grew in the first quarter of 2026. This exposes a strong irony. Havana attacks the United States in its speeches, but needs resources from the same market it demonizes to ease its own energy crisis somewhat. The cabinet meeting also showed that Trump wants to keep the Cuban issue under the direct control of the White House. Rubio acts as the political face of this pressure because he knows the weight of the Cuban exile community. He speaks directly to the Florida community and understands the symbolic strength of confronting a dictatorship that the left treated for decades as a romantic project. Now, the discourse has changed. Cuba appears as a failed regime governed by an incompetent elite, dependent on military structures, and unable to provide basic dignity to its own people. Havana tries to respond with verbal threats, international appeals, and sovereignty rhetoric. But the regime's claimed sovereignty doesn't benefit the Cuban people who endure hours without electricity or families relying on remittances. It doesn't reach the young person who crosses borders out of desperation, and it doesn't reach the worker who sees luxury hotels connected to state structures while his own household struggles with scarcity. This is the farce that Trump and Rubio put on the table. I am Milson Alves, an international relations analyst, and my purpose is to keep you well informed with the truth every day. The news links are in the video description. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end, check out the comments so you can be even more engaged with the Milson Alves community.